as the children are alive, so too exactly Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, based on the Gemara that says Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov doesn't die. And the Rebbe is explaining the idea of what is it, to understand what does it mean Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov doesn't die. You have to understand what does it mean Yaakov's alive. When we understand what it means Yaakov is alive, then you understand what it means Yaakov doesn't die, because the life of a tzaddik is Chaim Ruchnim. So much so that it's even more than just primary, secondary. But then the secondary, which is the goof, the body of the tzaddik, is like almost like a garment. And just like a person is alive, whether they're in a garment or not, and when you take off the garment, it doesn't change. It just changes that you're no longer dressed. So too, the tzaddik is so connected to the spiritual versus the physical that the physical is just like a garment, and therefore leaving the body doesn't change, because that was never the tzaddik's life. And therefore, although the tzaddik has the conditions of being in the physical body, for instance, like we said before, you have to make the brachas, etc. So if you want to make a bracha, you have to make a bracha on eating food, and it's the hand that puts on the tefillin and all that, but it doesn't change the fact that everything that the tzaddik does is though it's being done, could be physically, but it's connected to the ruchnis, and therefore, as long as the tzaddik is alive, that's the garment. And when the tzaddik goes to the next world or passes on, the tzaddik is still alive. It's just no longer in the garments of the physical. But the effect that the tzaddik has, meaning with the tzaddik's chassidim, talmidim, zare, with the children of the tzaddik, both physically and spiritually. So if you see that his children are alive, so too the tzaddik is alive. And the Rebbe is going to go deeper and deeper into this explanation. Meaning to say the point is that Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov didn't die. Why? Because we have to understand what it means Yaakov is alive. And then and the Gemara shows us the Mazar B'chaim Apu B'chaim. But again, like the Rebbe says, not that the children are living a legacy influenced by the tzaddik. If you see the children are alive, you know the tzaddik's alive. Why? Because as we're going to see now in today's class, and maybe the next class, how the life of the tzaddik has an effect on the Zari and the children, on the descendants, on the Talmidim. And from analyzing Talmidim, you can understand that Yaakov Avinu Leimeis, Yaakov didn't die. Let's continue. Sifches. Rebbe says, Umayi, to make sure that it's on the YouTube properly. Okay. So it's like this. What's the proof? How do we know if this person is a tzaddik? Not like we said before, but some people that they could be a tzaddik, but their secondary or their goof, the material is also important, so much so that the taste of the food, for instance, could be mavalvel them in making a bracha. For instance, if it disturbs them, the taste, and therefore they don't like it, therefore they can't make a bracha and they can't make a proper bracha. So what is the chacha? What's the sign? How do we know on the person in question that we're saying loy meis that didn't die? How do we know that this person's primary is the ruchnis and anything else is at best secondary? A gashmis any elotafel baba. The gashmis are only secondary. And therefore it's loy meis. Why? Because the chaim of the tzaddik was chaim ruchni, like the Alter Rebbe writes in the Geras HaKodesh, Elahu b'chaim, and therefore he's alive. Kasher roim shezar b'chaim. And what's the so he says? What's the chacha? How do we know if the tzaddik is a chaim of ruchnim? So that Rebbe answers, Kasher roim shezar b'chaim. When you analyze the children and you see that the children are chaim, which is going to be explained in a second, that shows you that the life of the tzaddik wasn't a chaim gashmi or chaim ruchnim. Again, we're not just talking about a person who lives just for material. When the person's connected, becomes the primary, stays material, even if they're doing everything, Torah mitzvahs, they're tzaddik. But how do we know if their life is a chaim ruchnim? Then you have to analyze Zari b'chaim. Do you look at the Zari, look at the descendants, look at the Talmidim, and you see that they're chaim? That's a sign that the life of the tzaddik was ruchni, and therefore he's b'chaim. And that's the meaning. Mazar b'chaim afu b'chaim. You could see from the Zari almost sort of say a scope that you could look into, and this shows us who the tzaddik was. Rabbeinu Zakim Mevar b'Tanya. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, chapter 35, 32, when he talks about the mitzvah of Avos Yisrael, Sha'aisim gufam ikar, that a person who their body is the primary, benafshem tefela, and their soul is secondary. In the very famous chapter Lev, which is the chapter of Avos Yisrael and Tanya. So one of the things that the Alter Rebbe explains over there, it's very important to understand that it's impossible for a person to have true Avos Yisrael as long as your goof is Ikar. If your body, your physical is the primary of who you are, on the highest level of Avos Yisrael, it's still you can't get out of yourself. And there's some sort of self there, and therefore it's not Avos Yisrael. Avos Yisrael, when it's not about you. When is it totally about the only way it can be totally about another person if your primary is not your physical. As long as your primary is your physical, so then you're separate from the next person. So he says, again, whoever's life is guf mikra, that your primary is your body, and your soul is secondary. You can't have true avas and ava and love between two people. How could you properly love someone like yourself? Can only be when your soul is your primary and your body secondary, and therefore you're not limited with the physical, and therefore you have the ability to properly connect with someone else. But in a case where so that's what the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that you have nafsham ikar and gufam tafel, that if your soul is the primary and your body is the secondary, then you can have true Avos Yisrael. The other goes even further. However, when a person is living a life, that their body is not just a secondary, it's not even a secondary. The goof and gashmias of the person, the body and the physical of the person is not at all an entity. It's not primary or secondary to the person. So then, so then, what does it mean? That the kamoicha is not just that you have, because your primary is your soul, therefore you're able to connect on your primary to the next person, but there's still a secondary of your body. But when you're totally don't even have a secondary, a body that's a secondary, meaning to say shanoisin gam lazulus, that hainu shanoisin gam lazulus, that everything. He even give to the other person everything. But in the case, sorry, let's do this again. Let's start again from the paragraph. However, when the person's body is not even a secondary, when it has no entity at all. Then the key is obvious. So then it's not that you have a secondary. Meaning to say, because your primary is your gu, is your nefesh, therefore you're giving everything to the other person. But you have also for yourself. The Rebbe says it's such a level when it's not just that you don't even have a secondary of body, and therefore you give yourself absolutely 100% over to the next person. And in the case over here, we're talking about a spiritual father, a Rebbe, to the Chassidim, to the Zulas. Over here is the Chassidim, that you give your entire life to the Zarei, that so that they should be able to live Torah mitzvahs. Meaning to say, Zar b'chaim, what does it mean that the children are alive? Pirusha, the translation is Sheroyim. Sheha'uvda sheploini hu b'chaim. When you look at the next person, meaning the student, the Zarei, and you see that person's alive, Shuchai b'Torah mitzvahs. What does it mean alive? That their life is Torah mitzvahs. Any el b'glal hiyes Zarei. How could that person be alive? What gives what gives the person the right to be alive? And what ability is this person living Torah mitzvahs? Because you say, oh, you know that person's living Torah mitzvahs. You know how that person's living Torah mitzvahs? Because he or she's a chassid of so-and-so. So Talmud is a Zari of so-and-so. The reason why Zari is b'chaim is because there's Zari. And why? How is the Zari b'chaim? Because the father, so to say, Yaakov Avinu, gives everything over. And when you give everything over, you're able to give your full life, so that person also is alive. The Dibra Oidis Yehudi, we're talking about a Yid, Rebbe says. Shechai Musalach Ben Egoyim. You're living amongst the Gentiles. You're living in the world. And the person has, like everyone else, an animal soul. So how are you really alive with Torah mitzvahs? How do you overcome this challenge? Yitzhak Ra, you have Yetzirah, the world around you. So how could you give that person life? How could you turn that person to be alive in the translation, meaning alive in Torah mitzvahs? There's a Hegab Atzmacham. Imagine. Isa Medrash, the Medrash says, if you gathered an understanding with all the artificial intelligence. But the fact is, if you gather all the people together, try to create a single mosquito, or lahalvin kanaf echad, or to make a proper wing of a mosquito, and it's not possible. You can't create actual life. And what are we saying? That this person shouldn't be alive spiritually. Almost like, what gives this person a right? How is it possible this person's alive? They're saying, well, you know why this person's alive? Because he or she is Zari. Because you're the descendant of so and so. And because you're Zari, because you're a student, a Talmud, spiritually a child of so and so, therefore you're alive. So what does it mean? That means that otherwise you wouldn't be alive. So the Medrash says you can't create life. You can't create even a mosquito. How could you create a person Torah mitzvahs? Therefore, the Rebbe says, this is that we're saying that you can't create something. That's when you are a creation, another creation can't create another creation. I was talking very strong Russian here. When the tzaddik is like the creator, like we said before, it's not that your nefesh is ikr, your nefesh is primary, your guf is tuffle, but you have a tuffle of a guf. You're totally not a mitzvah for yourself. Your whole mitzvah is the ruchnis. You're only a conduit, you're a messenger of the creator. Like the Alter Rebbe says in Torah last week of the idea of tzivakos. That the tzivakos is Hashem himself. The Eibusher makes through you that this person should become a creation. This person should become a person of Torah mitzvahs. The Rebbe says more than that. Person could ask another question. The Rebbe is saying, over here. What do you mean? Okay, fine. So he's a shliach of the Eibusher, and therefore, just like the Eibusher create, so the tzaddik is creating that this person should be zarei, meaning a zarei b'Torah mitzvahs. But even Hashem, it says, God doesn't decide if someone should be Yerushalayim. That's up to the person. So how can you say here that the person that Zari is B'chaim is because he's Zari, or she's Zari? The fact that you're a descendant, you're taking, Zari means, what the Rebbe is saying over here, is that, what it means, Mazari B'chaim, it's not just even a simon. The fact that you're Zari is the only reason why you're B'chaim. Because you're not for being Zari, you wouldn't be Chaim. Especially, we're talking about Chaim Ruchen, even Chaim Gashim, the Rebbe says, at least in the tape. The fact that you're here today is because you're Zari. The fact that you're Zari, that's why you're B'chaim. And that's why it's a simon of Mazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim. What kind of tzaddik is able to make that Zari should be B'chaim is a tzaddik who has a total Chaim Ruchnim, and therefore the tzaddik never passed away. So you can ask the question, but the Eibusher himself doesn't give you a Shemaim. How can this person make Zari Chaim? How could the tzaddik make that this person should be Zara, that this person should be B'chaim, because he or she is Zara, is a chassid, is a Talmud. Seemingly God himself, God himself doesn't decide if someone should be God-fearing. That's because that a Yid can do. The Rebbe says, because Hashem said, and again, analyze the actual words, v'yahavta d'reyecha k'moicha mamish, it's mamish like you. And by the Eibusher giving the mitzvah, v'yahavta k'moicha, he empowers, so to say, lahavdil a Yid to be able to be more powerful than the Hashem himself. Where Hashem is a kol b'dei shemaim chutz mi'yishamayim, but a tzaddik can make zet zara. If you're zara, then you're b'chaim. Mikol shkem kavchem emsichim litin leidavar gashmi k'dei lahachis es nafshay. Because in theory, the Rebbe doesn't say this, but seemingly what the Rebbe is saying is if you have to give the person gashmis, right? If the person's hungry, you say, it's my job to give the person food. God, give the person food. Why do I have to give the person food? The God says, no, of course, you have to give the person food. In that case, you're stepping in even more than God. God will not feed this person. If you don't give that person food, the person will die from hunger. You're stepping in and doing something even more than God is doing. God has not provided, you did provide. He's providing through you. Although if not for you, then he wouldn't provide this way. Because you're here to give tzedakah, he's giving through you. Although there's havish luchem l'makan. So the Rebbe says, if you have to give physical, even more so, you have to give spiritual life to this person. To be on that level, not everyone could be on that level. That's to be a person who's totally not just tafel, not guf from tafel, that the guf is secondary, and your nefesh is only primary. You have to be totally batul mitzias. So what the Rebbe is saying more in this class from what we learned yesterday is it's not just that we're talking about the nafshim ikar gufim tafel. It's going even further than what it says in Paraklamid Bay, that for this way of Chaim, it has to be mamish totally batul mitzias. You have to have no mitzias of gashmis. So Bishvil Zeh, no matter this, he explains in Tanya in Parak Vav. Bekivan she'izahu inyan she'tzarech lavi v'poil eitzel azulas limaspik bitul mitzias v'koyach el tzarech liyas bitul mitzias v'poil. And the Rebbe says, in order for it to be that you can actually give life to the next person, it's not that the tzaddik has potential to be nullified. The tzaddik is actually mamish. The mitzias doesn't exist, and therefore there's no such thing as meis, because that's the chaim is a chaim that there's no mitzias, there's no entity, there's no feeling of self. And when do you see this? When you see this person who's giving themselves totally over. Rebbe's talking about a Rebbe. The Rebbe's portion moisid nefesh lahachis is to give life to someone else. Person can say, 1 second, there's limits. How much do I have to give to myself for someone else? The Torah says your life comes first. So actually have mesirus nefesh for someone else, self-sacrifice for someone else. You can't look at any nichas shaka v'tara pidin. The tzaddik at this level is not having this conversation with themselves, measuring how much you have to give halachically to the next person. Moisid nafshi, the sees a person who needs, gives. Levad liyahachis Yehudi is long to give someone else life. This is we learn from the leaders. We're talking about Bazar B'chaim Afu B'chaim, applying this now to the older Nesiach Chabad. Heichel Me'admir Zakim, starting from the Alter Rebbe, we saw this idea of Bittul Mitzirus, which means Mitzirus Nefesh. 100% for the next person, totally giving everything to the next person. And therefore, when you have that total Bittul Mitzirus and total giving over of everything to the next person, you can create Zarai that they should be B'chaim. Including up to the Rebbe says to the Friedrich Rebbe. To do just a favor for a Yid, that's not Chabad. That's Shulchan Aruch says you have to do a favor. This is not what Chassidus came to teach a person to do a favor a Yid, to do a favor a Yid. What Terech came to add over here, Chassidus came to add. Like the Rebbe spoke before, and I think that Yid Tzkislev was the famous in the Havan in Yoni Terech Chassidus. And Tashin Chavav Yud Tzkislev. A pure Shatoyer. Chassid, what does it mean a chassid? A chassid doesn't just do the max up into what halacha says, but you give even everything of yourself. Like it says about burning the nails. You're ready to burn the nails, you're ready to put yourself in danger. Shaltev says was to do a favor for an Yid. We found this, that I'm saying, coming tonight onto Yud Shvat. You see this by the life of the Baal Hayilula, the Friedrich Rebbe. Super Pam, as the Rebbe told, the Petibur, Zman Tsar, in the time of his father, he wasn't even a Rebbe then, he was a young boy, but he went to Petersburg, a whole story on Shabbos, to be able to be the battle, to nullify a decree. He had to spend Shabbos in a pub, everything was dangerous. The whole thing was dangerous to maybe be able to nullify a decree that he had against the Jews. That was totally self-sacrifice. This was on a doubt. Maybe to nullify a decree on Jewish people was a decree on Kashmirs, if I'm not mistaken. But even if it was Baroknis, the Friedrich Rebbe gave his life up, put his life in danger to be able to possibly change the mind of the Gzera. But Askam Kamba made the earlier, so we find this more Bishnaisa in this Yosef when he became Nasi, when the Friedrich Rebbe was Rebbe. The Medina how the Friedrich Rebbe had pushed itself Mesiras Nefesh, as we all know. Self-sacrifice of the Rebbe Riyat, the Friedrich Rebbe in Medina, he means in Russia under the Soviets. Shanim ke'elush b'chol yom v'yom. There were years when the Previous Rebbe lived there that every single day, from the beginning to the end of the day, his life was in every moment was involved in self-sacrifice and danger for both his physical and spiritual health. He didn't do it for himself. It wasn't like he needed to have a high spiritual level, and therefore he was self-sacrificed. If the Previous Rebbe would want to sit in his own library and study Torah, and study by himself, if he wanted to perform mitzvahs on the highest level himself. The communists wouldn't bother. They're not going to bother the Previous Rebbe to try to change his Previous Rebbe. He shouldn't be put on tefillin. They wouldn't touch it. Why would the Previous Rebbe live a life? In what way did the Previous Rebbe live a life of self-sacrifice? That he wanted to have a live chassidim, and he was successful, and he affected. He gave up everything. That the Zare, his chassidim, should be alive. And this can only be to give such life, to have this power is only when a person, when they live as their soul in their body. Like he says before, that even when he was alive, not only wasn't his life, that his physical life wasn't just a primary, there wasn't even a secondary of physicality. The physical is nothing. Although again, doesn't affect how the Previous Rebbe had to do mitzvahs. The Previous Rebbe made a mitzvah when he ate a piece of bread. He made a shahakal on a glass of liquid, eating a piece of meat. But his whole life was all about the ruchnius. Because the physical, whether it's the mitzvah, whether it's the body, was all just vessels, like clothing, garments. How he could be effective in the world. So when the garment is needed, he's in that garment. The garment is no longer needed or changed, he goes to another garment. But he's alive, because once it's chaim 100%. In himself. So the Rebbe starts off the Sicha trying to officially building a case to show that that we stay with Yaakov Avinu Loimeis. The end of the Sicha that I was going to, that's not the Chiddush of Yaakov's life. The Chiddush is that his children are alive. And the very fact that you see his children alive, how are they alive? Is because because they're Zarei. And we're talking about such a person that the Chaim, such a Chaim is ruching him, and therefore he's able to have that the Zarei should be Chaim. Chiddush is that the children are alive, that the Chassidim are alive. Nimtza, who sees more than this since Gimel Tamas of Hatzlacha. Chassidim are having shluchim, men, women out there, young people that never even saw the Rebbe, Abi Matzliach in a way that's no one ever seen before. In history, we haven't seen before. Why? Hazari b'chayim, because who b'chayim? So when you see that the fact that the Zari are alive, because he's alive, otherwise the Zari wouldn't be alive. Don't think that's lacking the physical body, but that's not who he is. Like we said before, to understand what it means Yaakov Avinu Loimeis, you have to understand what it means Yaakov Avinu Chai. Now he had another, then he had one garment until Tavshin Yud, till Tavshin Beis, and now there's another garment. Yaakov Avinu Loimeis. And this is what the Gemara means. Yaakov didn't pass away. Yaakov's not dead. Why? Did they not eulogize him? Did they not preserve him? You look at Yaakov and look at his descendants that are living in Mitzrayim. The same thing applies throughout the diaspora, throughout the generations. And you say, why? How are these people living like this? Where do they have the koyach to be so alive? It's because they're Zara, because the chassidim of the Rebbe. Then you never understood what he mean he was alive in the first place. When you look at a chassid today in 5,786, and you see this hatzlacha of a chassid that the b'chaim is because you never understood what it meant he was alive the whole time. It wasn't a chaim gashmi. It was because the Rebbe was chayim ruchni, is chayim ruchni. כשרואים שיעקב הם זר בארץ מצרים, וכל סך, ולחס בשאר גולס, ורואים שהם חיים גלל היסם זרי, הרי זו הכרחה שבמשך כל שני זה לא יעשה לחיים לכם. You didn't understand what it meant that he was alive in the first place. ואילו הגשמיס היסר לא רק עניין של תופעה, אלא גם לבוש לבד. It was only a garment. It wasn't just a secondary, like a secondary of a primary. It was just literally like a garment, which is much less than a secondary. He's the same time, if not, and on that even more so. The change is only in the garment. Like a person who changes clothing. You're not going to say, shh, now you're dressed in a suit, you're a different person. You could look like a different person. You could say, you could compliment the person, they look better, sharper. Same person, it's the same me. Is people who like to judge people by the book, by the cover. So you say, oh, the person looks like a shlemazel, maybe they're a shlemazel. You look at my clothing, look at how I project myself. That's not me. It doesn't change me whether you think it or not. The Rebbe continues and go further. I think let's see the next Sicha. Is anyone? Yeah, so let's, we're not going to finish the whole Sicha, but let's just finish one more paragraph. When it comes to Yud Shvat, the Hilula, Kasher Misas from Yachto, we gathered together. Already years after the union of whatever happened on the Yom Hilula. We say you said eulogies, and we put on and there was the burial, all the things, the anointments, etc. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the Alter Rebbe tells us, "Shakashem Duber Oid Sadik Shbechaim Chayusah B'Yaisa in Hashem B'Guf Kan Lamata B'Seret Tvachim V'Yuchayiv Leichaim Ser Melachim Ruchim." We're talking about such a person. In this world, that wasn't their life. It wasn't their ikr. It wasn't their tachel. It was like a levush, and their whole life was ruchniim. There's such thing as there's no life. There's no longer a life. There's no such thing as Yaakov Avinu meis. Yaakov Avinu le meis. That doesn't change the fact that they eulogized him and they put him in and they put the body in preservatives, but that wasn't him. And these are the things halakhically you have to do to a person who goes when the body is no longer here. This is only the physical garment of the tzaddik. And now the tzaddik is in a better, the Rebbe says, a better garment. On the contrary, like the Alter Rebbe says in the Geras HaKodesh, any limitations the tzaddik had up until this point is no longer there. That's why again, mamish we see from Topshin and Dalit, the Hatzlacha Chassidim had gets stronger and stronger every year. The Hatzlacha is growing. What was Hatzlacha in 1994? You can't even compare it to the Hatzlacha in 1904 and 214 and 224 and 226. Once upon a time, there was a limitation of space, and you had to go to a certain place because that's what the tzaddik was. If you wanted to speak to him, all those limitations are not here anymore. You could sit in America, you could sit in Eretz Yisrael, you could sit anywhere in the world, right, and connect to the Rebbe. In the same way you would be connecting to the Rebbe if you had to go to fly to New York at certain times. The proof is. We look around and we gather together. You look around and you see the fact. You see the fact that there's people alive spiritually. And the Rebbe adds the very fact that they're alive spiritually is why they're alive physically. The Chayim Ruchnim of the Chassidim gives the Chaim Gashmin. And why the alive Chayim Ruchnim and Gashmin is because there's Zarek. Because Gashmis and Ruchnis is one by a Yid. See, Beglal Yes is Zar because we're his Chassidim. When you see that the children are alive in Torah mitzvahs, Gashmis and Ruchnis, they're living alive here and alive in another country. All over the world. The Rebbe is even in Russia at the time. And able to have Mesiras Nefesh, that's a sign that he's alive because the fact that Zara B'chaim is because who's B'chaim? Who B'chaim, the Rebbe says, the Rebbe is alive. You're not as if alive, or Chaim im Pirushim, or to try to explain it, it means this or it means that, like the Rebbe said for Vaser. Shainim Chaim mit Pshetlach, trying to give this kind of twist or spin to it. You look at the children, you see, just like you're not going to give a spin how the Chassid's alive, you're not going to give a spin how the Rebbe's alive. The fact that you see a person's able to conquer the world is because Zari B'chaim is because B'chaim. Because the Rebbe is alive now. Right, so we're going to stop here, of course, and wish everyone a meaningful Yud Shvat. As just Shem will continue tomorrow.